Joel, I've got something come on the screen that says it's live.
Yes, because we are live.
Good.
At the moment, we are live at Facebook Mutiny. We are live on YouTube of Mutiny Speaks, and we are live on Joel Vos Facebook. So everyone else and everywhere in the world, welcome to our live stream of Mutiny.
Give it 5 minutes, Joel, before we kick. Well, Rowan, actually, because you're going to share, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right.
And I will make Rowan then also a chair here in this meeting. So Rowan, I'm now changing you to the host.
Cheers.
Have you seen anything now on your app or anything, Rowan?
Yes, I can see that. Yeah, I've got extra.
Oh, brilliant. So unfortunately, I have a double meeting. That's very problematic. But the beauty of it is actually that we are all now recording this and live streaming. So I'll be able to see everything later again. So yeah, I'm gonna pop in and pop out in this meeting, unfortunately.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you for setting that.
So are you okay, Rowan? Have you got everything you need?
Yeah, I've got it all. Yeah, just sort of.
Okay, good.
I'm probably going to start by muting everyone so that we don't get any odd sound stuff. So if you need to speak, you can sort of unmute yourself by clicking on participants, and then you should see various options. Equally, when we get to questions phase, you can use that same screen and participants to raise your hands so that I know to call on you to speak. So I think we're ready to begin. Sorry, you were trying to say something, Neil. There you go.
Just give it a couple more minutes for people to log on before we start speaking. We're not quite there, according to my clock anyway. We're not quite there yet.
Oh yeah, that's right. We're still a minute off 8, and we can wait a bit longer.
And you might need, once we're ready to go, you might need to say that again so that everybody's clear about, because with this number of people, I think it's essential when we get to the discussion that people raise their hands on the device. Otherwise, it will get chaotic. Okay, I'll mute myself again.
Okay, I'll leave a few more minutes just so that everyone can arrive. Hi, well, I think we can probably begin now. We have a really good turnout, 27 participants, as I can see. I'm sure a few more people will turn up as we go along, and hopefully they'll catch up. So, hello all, and welcome to this event with Mutiny. We are a new organization of the internationalist left, and you can find us online at timetomutiny.org. We are very fortunate to have with us William Robinson, who is Professor of Sociology at the University of California at Santa Barbara and a member of the International Parliamentary and Civil Society Mission to investigate the political transition in Iraq. He has many publications, including Globalization and Postmodern Politics and Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Humanity. His new book, which will be released by Pluto Press this July, is called The Global Police State. Robinson is at the forefront of new thinking about world capitalism, developing key concepts such as the transnational capitalist class and the globalized police state. He is zooming in from the US today and will be leading the discussion on the COVID-19 pandemic in the context of the world capitalist crisis. I'm sure I speak for everyone in thanking him for speaking to us today. And I'm just going to unmute you, William. There you go.
Okay, well, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the tuning in the world. I want to thank you, Rowan, for that introduction. I'd like to thank also Neil and Phil and Mutiny for organizing this and for this opportunity. I'm going to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, so I'm barely going to be able to scratch the surface of all the things we need to look at and analyze today. And at some points, I'm going to go into some deep political economy analysis, which I think is necessary for us to understand what's going on. And there's little doubt at this point that we're entering the worst crisis in a century of world capitalism. And in many ways, the crisis is worse than the 1930s. It's really difficult to underestimate the magnitude of this crisis, but we also need to be clear that coronavirus didn't cause the crisis. Rather, the virus was the trigger. Global capitalism was already in deep crisis, a multidimensional crisis. Here, I want to emphasize two dimensions. And one is the structural, that is a crisis of overaccumulation, and I'll go into a little more detail on that soon, or that is a crisis of stagnation. We want to remember that already by the end of 2019, much of Latin America and Africa had already entered into recession. The European Union and the United States was teetering on the verge of recession. Growth levels in Asia were significantly on the decline. Stock markets worldwide were teetering. Asset bubbles were very close, a number of asset bubbles, very close to bursting. There was a drop in commodity prices, and of course, the oil market completely collapsed. And in fact, since 2015, there's been a steady decline in worldwide industrial production and output. But the crisis is also very much political, one of state legitimacy and of capitalist hegemony. I think we can say that we are spiraling into a general crisis of capitalist rule. And the world capitalist system is entering into this period of chaos. We're stepping into the unknown here. The key point with the pandemic is that it aggravates tremendously, many times over, the crisis of global capitalism that we were already facing. This, for me, is a turning point. There's going to be no return to so-called normality. The pandemic has pulled back the curtain on the total failure of neoliberal capitalism, but I take it a step further and say the failure of global capitalism more generally. But we want to, when we look at the pandemic, emphasize its class character and also the devastating social consequences for the global working class and the majority of people around the world. You're all, I'm listening to this, probably familiar with the data. The organization, the International Labor Organization first reported that 200 million people will lose their job. And then a few weeks later, they increased that to say 1/2 of the world's workers are at risk. We know in the United States, 40 million people have lost their job, joining millions of others that already were unemployed. The ILO also reported that approximately that over 400 million small businesses could go out of business. Oxfam, for its part, reported that at least 500 million people are slipping now into poverty, joining the ranks of those that were already in poverty. And you're all familiar with the dramatic statement by the Food and Agricultural Organization that 30 million people face death by starvation. And then just a few days later, they changed that to say that we are facing hunger on a biblical scale. And the most vulnerable here are the 700 million transnational and internal migrants, refugees, those in war zones, those incarcerated, those in immigrant detention centers, and especially the urban poor in the world's mega cities. So the social consequences, the social impact is absolutely devastating. But we want to focus here on the strategy of what I call the transnational capitalist class, which is very clear, a classic case here of disaster capitalism. The strategy from above is to transfer the crisis, the cost of the crisis, and the sacrifices that it involves onto the backs of the global working class. You're all familiar with bailouts, but the figure is absolutely alarming. Just the United States and the European Union have already passed $8 trillion in bailouts in subsidies to capital, with scraps, little crumbs for workers and the poor. And the strategy here is a repetition, but on a much grander scale, of what happened with the financial collapse of 2008, in which the capitalist states are injecting this trillions of dollars into the banks and into corporations. And the banks have no obligation whatsoever to rechannel those funds to poor people, to the working class at all. In fact, what they did in 2008 and what we can expect now is that they're going to use those resources to snatch up assets all around the world. They're going to use them for further financial speculation. Millions of small businesses and medium-sized businesses are going bankrupt, even some big corporations, and those are all going to be snatched up and further concentrated. And the transnational capitalist class is going to turn this into a profit-making opportunity already. And you might have seen these reports that in just 3 weeks of the pandemic in the United States, the wealthiest groups increased their wealth by $240 billion. So we're going to see, we are seeing, and we're going to see as we move from beyond the health emergency into this deep crisis of capitalism, a much greater concentration and centralization of capital on a global scale. But I want to talk now a little bit more abstractly about what type of crisis we are facing here. I've been writing about the crisis of global capitalism since 2008, since that financial collapse. And we can identify 3 types of crises. One is the cyclical crises. These are the business cycle, and they occur approximately once every 10 years. There was a recession, a business crisis in the early 1980s, the early 1990s, then the turn into the 21st century. But the crisis we're in now is much more serious. It's what we call a structural crisis. Structural crises typically take place every 40 to 50 years or so. There was a big structural crisis worldwide in the 1870s, 1880s, another one, of course, in the 1930s, the Great Depression. The last structural crisis before 2008 was the crisis of the 1970s, which led us to capitalist globalization. And then we've moved into a new structural crisis in 2008. And with the pandemic, it's now accelerating many times over. So one reason we call it structural crisis, because these are what we can say are restructuring crises, meaning the only way to get out of a structural crisis is to restructure the way capitalism is functioning, how it's organized, its institutions, and so forth. So the structural crisis of the 1880s was resolved through a new round of colonialism and imperialism worldwide. The structural crisis of the 1930s was resolved through a new form of capitalism, which we can call New Deal capitalism, social democratic capitalism. The more technical term is Fordist Keynesian capitalism. Then we had this big structural crisis of the 1970s, and that was resolved. And when I say resolved, I mean for the capitalist system, not for the masses of humanity. That was resolved by capitalist globalization and the rise of a globally integrated production and financial system in which every country of the world has been progressively integrated into this globally integrated production and financial system. And we saw, since in the wake of the 1970s crisis, the rise of truly transnational capital and what I'm calling the transnational capitalist class, which might compete with local and national and regional capitals, but transnational capital has emerged over the last 4 decades as the hegemonic fraction of capital on a world scale, led by transnational finance capital, by the big banks and financial institutions. And now the transnational finance capital is fusing with the tech sector and with what we can call the global military industrial security complex. So from the 1980s, from this rise of capitalist globalization to 2008, we saw the globalization boom, an expansion of the global economy and an offensive of the transnational capitalist class. But since 2008, we've seen deepening stagnation. But I want to, before I go back to stagnation and to that structural dimension of the crisis, what I'm calling overaccumulation, I want to say that this, what we've seen also since 2008 in the face of the stagnation and the financial collapse is a new round of worldwide economic restructuring, worldwide capitalist restructuring. And now with the pandemic, that restructuring is already and is going to dramatically accelerate. And that is based on a much greater digitalization of the whole global capitalist system. Let's look at this for a moment. The capitalist globalization from the late 1970s and on was based, at least technologically, on the rise of computer and information technology and on the internet. And that allowed this restructuring worldwide. Now we are on the cusp of what's being called the fourth industrial revolution, driven by artificial intelligence and machine learning, and on the collection and the processing of data, what's been called big data, but also involving robotization, bio and nanotechnology, quantum and cloud computing, 3D printing, autonomous vehicles, and other new technologies, all wrapped around digitalization. And now this new round of profound restructuring, which again began about 10, 12 years ago, especially after the 2008 financial collapse, but is now going to tremendously accelerate, is based on a much more extensive and profound digitalization of the whole global economy, including, very importantly now, the digitalization of services worldwide, because we had, through digitalization and through capitalist globalization, we had the rise of globalized production and globalized finance. But now services are joining that. And here we can talk about platforms which are globalized, e-commerce, telework, telemedicine, remote learning, and so forth. And here's the key point. The pandemic and the types of things taking place now through the pandemic are going to dramatically accelerate this worldwide globalized digitalization, and especially services. And we've seen dramatically the rise of hypertrophy, gigantic, mammoth tech corporations that we're all familiar with. We're speaking on Zoom right now, Amazon, Facebook, Tencent, Alibaba, Apple, Microsoft. And so what we're seeing here, these tech companies already were moving over the last 10, 12 years, and the data is absolutely dramatic. I don't have any time to present it, how they've become so bloated and come to occupy the very core of the global capitalist economy. And these tech sector is as fusing, that is Silicon Valley is also fused with transnational finance capital and fused with the military industrial security complex. So these tech companies are flourishing during the pandemic, and they're going to emerge as even more powerful. And this block of capital that I just mentioned, Silicon Valley fused with transnational finance capital and the military industrial security complex, is really becoming the hegemonic block of capital at the very core of the post-pandemic paradigm, which is now becoming clear. And as I mentioned, we're going to see a vast new centralization and concentration of capital on a global scale. And it's hard to underestimate the influence and the control that this block of capital is now exercising and even increasing its power over capitalist states. So one of the buzzwords right now, and this is especially in New York, some of you might have seen Mario Cuomo announced this great new initiative, which is, and he's calling it, and this has been a buzzword now for several decades, public-private partnerships. Well, that's just a euphemism. A public-private partnership means that the state subsidizes capital and the state privatizes and turns over to capital functions which were previously run by the state. And in this particular case, for instance, the case of New York, which is sort of a model now for what's going to be going on all over the world. Schooling, infrastructure, the functions of now geo-tracking around the virus, all of this now is involving state-private partnerships, which simply means that capital is going to acquire a much greater role over economy and society and over the state. So I mentioned that I want to look more closely now at the structural crisis of what I've been calling overaccumulation. And here we need to go into a little more detail into some political economic theory. And what we can call the most fundamental internal contradiction of capitalism is revolved around this overaccumulation, and more technically what we call the increasing organic composition of capital. And what I mean by that, what we mean by that in Marxist political economy, is that as capitalism develops, there's more and more fixed capital, more and more machinery, more and more technology relative to human labor involved in capitalist in the capitalist production process. And so the more and more you have machines and technology, then the less and less you have workers relative to that fixed capital, or what's technically called constant capital. You have the rate of profit tends to fall. And that's a problem for capitalists and for capital, which needs to maximize the rate of profit. So I'm going to use some technical terms here for those of you not so familiar with Marxist political economy, but we can say then that overaccumulation and stagnation, and we're going to see just how important that is to understand what's going on in global capitalism and in global society. But as we can say that this overaccumulation originates in the circus of production, with the introduction of more and more machinery and technology relative to human labor. But it is expressed, overaccumulation is expressed, we see it, we feel it in the sphere of circulation, that is in the market, or what we can call overproduction or underconsumption, meaning that the global economy has increasingly, through capitalist globalization, produced more and more wealth, more and more output in the global economy. Yet the global market is shrinking. The global market cannot absorb what the output of the global economy. This is part of the internal dynamics of how capitalism works. It generates, by its nature, capitalism generates increasing social polarization and inequality, rooted in what I had previously pointed out. So you're all familiar with this data. 1% of humanity now controls over 50% of the world's wealth. And more significantly, 20% of humanity controls 95% of the world's wealth. So that 20% represents those sectors of global society that can survive in one way or another in global capitalism and even flourish. But 80% of humanity is left with only 5% of the world's wealth. We've never seen these levels of inequality. This is simply unprecedented. And it means, once again, that the majority of humanity cannot consume. The more the global economy develops and can produce more and more wealth, the less the global market can absorb that wealth. And so that leads to stagnation. It leads to, and the essence of overaccumulation is that capital has accumulated so much wealth, but it cannot profitably reinvest that wealth because of this stagnation. Now, here's the key point leading that to what's going on with digitalization and with the pandemic. So digitalization And again, digitalization, the first round goes back to the 1980s with the introduction of computer and information technology, but it dramatically accelerates in the last 10 years since the crisis of 2008, 2009. And now with the pandemic, it's taking another qualitative leap forward, digitalization. And again, digitalization, to say that technically, involves a vast increase in the organic composition of capital, basically meaning that digitalized and fourth industrial revolution technologies, except in an increasing way, replaces human labor. So here's a piece of data just to give you an idea of this. In 1979, General Motors, and at one point General Motors was the biggest corporation in the world. And they said here in the United States, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States because it was so central to the US and then the global economy. So in 1979, which is the eve of moving into capitalist globalization and the introduction of computer information technology, had 1 million workers, General Motors, just a little less than 1 million workers, and generated in that year, 1979, $11 billion in revenues. Fast forward to 2012, Google has $14 billion in revenues, more than General Motors had, yet only 38,000 workers. So 1 million workers, 38,000 workers. And that was in 2012. This process dramatically accelerated in the last 8 years since 2012. And what's been happening, but there's been some resistance to this, and the pandemic decreases that resistance to this, is the rapid digitalization of all these different sectors. There's not a single sector of the global economy, not a single employment branch that is not affected by transferring from human labor to these new technologies. This includes the robotization of factories, of course, professions, even legal profession, medical profession, moving to become digitalized rather than human labor. Industry, but even agriculture. Here in California, now there's an automatic a machine that picks and shakes the branches and gets the grapes, because there's a big wine production here in California, and then takes those grapes to a factory which processes them, no human labor. They now have a machine being introduced to pick strawberries. So even in labor-intensive areas like agriculture. And so theoretically, we can move, and we are pushing towards this laborless production, meaning this massive production of the global capitalist system with less and less and less workers through automation. So I mentioned then that this new round of worldwide structuring based on a more advanced digitalization and fourth industrial revolution technology is now vastly accelerated by the pandemic and by the aftermath, as we move into the aftermath of the pandemic. And this is going to greatly increase social inequality and social polarization worldwide. It's going to dramatically increase the precaritization of labor, meaning that these technologies result in much less labor, but those that do remain as workers are de-skilled and also precaritized rather than regular fixed workers. So instead of taxi drivers, you have Uber workers. But it also dramatically increases surplus labor, what I call surplus humanity. That portion of humanity simply locked out of the global economy, no use to capital except holding wages down. And already 1/3 of humanity before this crisis was considered surplus humanity, locked out of the global economy. That's going to dramatically increase. So the whole face of the global economy and global society is going to be radically altered, and in a way which has tremendous implications, which when I, in a few minutes, move towards my conclusion, I'll refer to those implications. But first I want to say that this restructuring I'm talking about is actually going to intensify the contradictions of global capitalism, not resolve them. There's going to be ever greater stagnation. And as there's ever greater stagnation, the transnational capitalist class is desperate to find outlets to unload all of this surplus accumulated capital, outlets which will bring it profit. And so we can already see in the last 2 decades, maybe, since the early 21st century, accelerating from 2008, what have those outlets been? Because the outlet can't be 80% of humanity that doesn't consume. So especially financial speculation. And I've put forward in my recent writings this piece of data, that in 2018, the whole world GDP, the whole total production of goods and services worldwide was valued at $75 trillion. right? Everything that human beings produce for goods and services. Yet financial speculation, just in derivatives, in 2018 was $1.2 quadrillion. So this is an enormous gap, unprecedented. We can't even wrap our minds around this gap between the real economy and what we call fictitious capital. Real economy, 75 trillion. Fictitious capital, just in derivatives, 1.2 quadrillion. So what happened that's financial speculation, to unload this surplus in the face of stagnation and overaccumulation. What happened in 2008 is that there were massive bailouts, not to the scale that we've seen now, much less, but there were massive bailouts. They were recycled. Those bailouts went to the banks, and the banks used all of that bailout money from 2008 to recycle it into even more financial speculation into the global economy, recycled it and used it to snatch up assets and resources all around the world, including land grabs, just to have land for speculation, for instance, which involved greater displacement of people from the countryside, more dispossession, more inequality, the aggravation of all of these contradictions, the structural, but also the political, economic, social contradictions of all of this. And now they have, just in the United States and the European Union, $8 trillion channeled into, as bailouts, into the coffers of banks and corporations. The second outlet for this surplus accumulated capital up until 2020, has been debt-driven growth, meaning that consumer debt worldwide is at an all-time high. Corporate debt is at an all-time high, and state debt, government debt, sovereign debt is at an all-time high worldwide. You go into incredible debt to continue to consume, push the global economy forward, but that debt reaches a breaking point and everything collapses. And right before the pandemic, debt levels globally, total corporate, consumer, and state debt was approaching $300 trillion. And then, so that's a second outlet for this surplus accumulated capital to stave off the collapse that was coming anyway, and the pandemic finally triggered. The third outlet, and this is critically important because it involves politics and the struggle now during and post-pandemic, the struggle from below of the global working class, has what I've been calling militarized accumulation. And here we have very clearly the link between global economics and global politics, in the sense that how do you continue to making profit in the face of stagnation and the shrinkage of the global market? Well, you fan wars, you fan and encourage conflicts and political tensions and systems of transnational social control and repression. And you do that, of course, to contain global surplus humanity and the global working class. But the point I'm making here is you do that because it's incredibly profitable. Rounds of destruction and reconstruction and conflicts and repression and locking up immigrants and so forth and so on are incredibly profitable, and it allows for an unloading of surplus accumulated capital and profit making when you can't do it by other means. So that takes me, and I will soon be concluding, but there's one other theoretical point here, theoretical and political point we need to explore. And it is this, then this leaves me what I previously said to my concept of the global police state, and the title of my new book. And it was originally scheduled to be released in July, just very soon, another few weeks from now, but because of the pandemic, they pushed it back to September. So that will be out in September. But what I mean by the global police state are three things, that concept. First is militarized accumulation, as I just mentioned. That systems of transnational social control and repression, making wars, fanning conflicts, etc. All of that is a source of accumulation of capital and profit making, independent of political or geopolitical objectives. Secondly, what I mean by global police state is the vast expansion of these new systems of transnational social control and repression. And third, what I mean by that is the rise of neo-fascist or 21st century fascist political systems, authoritarian and neo-fascist systems. The three of them combined with the concept of global police state helps us understand those three and how they are linked to capitalism and the crisis of capitalism. So what happens with the pandemic now is that the pandemic is generating this current crisis, vastly expanding the need that dominant groups have for social control and repression. When you have hundreds of millions thrown into unemployment, when you have hundreds of millions facing starvation, the mass displacement going on, the ruling groups need more than ever to expand these systems of social control and repression. So the pandemic is going to intensify that dimension of global police state. But secondly, and this is clear and this is important to see, the pandemic is expanding that second dimension of global police state, meaning it's opening up new opportunities for accumulation through social control, and I'll get to that in just one moment. And third, the pandemic is also creating fertile new conditions for neo-fascist forces to mobilize. So we're facing, and let me just give you an example, by the way, of that. The global surveillance state has been coming about for quite a number of years now, but with the pandemic, you have the vast expansion of tracking technologies. You have the vast expansion of these online platforms. We're speaking right now on Zoom, right? And so forth. And so the ability to carry out social control and repression is greatly intensified through the pandemic. But for me, what's so alarming here, what we need to focus on is the grave threat now of 21st century fascism. I know that Mutiny and Neil and Phil have been talking about creeping fascism. That's a great term. We're thinking along the same lines, but now it's even not so creeping. It's really leaping forward. I've been writing about the threat of 21st century fascism for the last 12 years. I started looking at this systematically in 2008. And for me, fascism, whether it's 20th century variety or it's 21st century variety, fascism is always a particular response to capitalist crisis. And it is a response which, among other things, rests on having to construct a mass social base. And the basis of fascism building a social base is, in times of crisis, promising to restore order and security in times of crisis. And it is a response to the severe mass social anxiety and insecurity and destabilization that crises generate from masses of people, masses of poor working class people, and those disruptions. Now, the difference between, and this we can debate, I know there's a lot of debate about it, but the difference between early 20th century fascism, because there's many similarities, but a key difference is the early 20th century fascism was, its mass social base was the petty bourgeoisie, those small business owners, et cetera, that were being displaced and facing insecurity as a result of capitalist development. Now, in this 21st century, the mass potential and real base of 21st century fascism is sectors of the global working class. But which sectors in particular? Those sectors that were formerly privileged, such as white male state workers and stable employment with high incomes in the first world, in the cores of world capitalism. And these formerly privileged sectors of the global working class have been destabilized and have been facing increasing insecurity as a result of capitalist globalization, restructuring, precaritization, rising surplus labor, everything we've spoken about. And so you see with 21st century fascism, the drive to capture that mass social base, involving, of course, the same as 20th century fascism, a racist mobilization against scapegoats, extreme masculinization, because that masculinization is tied to the discipline of capital's ability to discipline, martial ideologies, that is increased militarism, millennialism. Now in the United States, this millennialism is taking many forms, including these doomsday groups that say doomsday is coming, and survivalist strategies. And I want to analyze here, because now this is important to understand the dangers we face now, and the danger again is intensified many times over by the pandemic. That for me, fascism, and in this case 21st century fascism, involves a triangulation of three things. One is reactionary and repressive political power in the state. And I'm going to take the example, as I discuss this now, of the United States. But this fascism is rising around the world, in Europe, in India, in Israel, and elsewhere. So you have with Trump and the right wing of the Republican Party, and the right wing of the Republican Party is one extreme right, bordering on a fascist right, and it's the one that has control over the Republican Party. And so you have these fascist forces having a hold over the US state. We don't have fascism yet in the US. We're on the verge of that threat. The second part of this triangulation, in addition to reactionary and repressive state, second is that fuses with transnational capital. Now, I have to say something, and we can debate this when we move in just a few minutes towards discussion. But there's a lot of confusion that Trump is a populist and that Trump represents national capital. That's simply not true. The empirical evidence doesn't suggest anything of the sort. The transnational capitalist class might not like some of the political programs and agree with all of Trump and his being a buffoon and so forth, but they love his economic program. He's done everything for transnational capital, from regressive taxation to massive subsidies for capital to deregulation to assaults on unions and workers and so forth. So that's the second plank. Again, this is a triangulation when we try to understand 21st century fascism. The third part of that triangle is a fascist mobilization in civil society. If you don't have that, what you might have is authoritarianism or dictatorship, but not what we understand as fascism. Fascism has to secure a mass base in civil society. And of course, the Nazis did that. I'll have a little more to say about that and how we can understand 2020. But here in the United States, to go back to that example, you see a dramatic fascist mobilization in civil society, intensified first when Trump came to power in 2016-17, but now intensifying much more with the pandemic. So you have right-wing armed militias, you have the white nationalists, the Nazis, the Klan, the anti-immigrant movement, the people that have now resurrected the Tea Party in a new form, the Patriot movement. Some of you or many of you will be familiar with this. This incredible mobilization in civil society of a real and a potential base for fascism. And I want to say that those right-wing militias have already fused with the Republican Party at the local level all over the country. And Trump is fanning that right-wing, that fascist armed mobilization. So you see these things coming together crystal clear here in the US, this project of 21st century fascism. And what the key point is, because we're talking about the pandemic, is the conditions of the pandemic are accelerating this process. The anti-lockdown protests that you are in the UK and around the world might be familiar with what's been going on here, involves those far-right armed militias linking up with Trump and with the right wing of the Republican Party. And it's not just that. Also, part of this switch of this dangerous move towards fascism is ordering workers back to work. But we've never seen that, where you are ordered by presidential decree back into work under extremely dangerous conditions. And the campaign against immigrants was always extremely repressive. Obama was the deportation president. He deported more people than Trump deported. But the way the anti-immigrant campaign is now unfolding is truly fascist. I mean, these detention camps for the immigrants is the equivalent of Nazi concentration camps and so forth. So here's the thing to conclude this point, that as the pandemic intensifies inequality, mass unemployment, mass suffering, this heightens the need that the ruling groups have for social control and repression to keep a lid on the mass explosions that are coming. And so that means that the transnational capitalist class, because some of you may say, and rightly so, well, not all groups of capitalists agree with fascism. They might love Trump's economic policies, neoliberalism, capitalist globalization, assaults on workers' power, but they don't want fascism. But when you have this incredibly intensified need for mass social control and repression and containment of the global working class, you might see, and we will see, the move towards many groups within the transnational capitalist class to embrace 21st century fascism. Now, I mentioned, I'll go back to the Nazis. Let's remember what happened. The German capitalist class in the 1930s did not want anything to do with the Nazis. They were anti-Nazi. But eventually, given the crisis of capitalist crisis in Germany, capitalists started to embrace the Nazis because they were going to crush the socialists and the working class and any opponents, but also because the Nazis then created all of these accumulation and profit-making opportunities and ideal conditions for capital. So then you got that fusion. So let's remember after 2001, the events of 2001, governments all over the world passed these draconian so-called anti-terrorism laws, which allowed them to tremendously increase repression and control and surveillance. And now in the pandemic in 2020, governments have decreed national emergencies, ruling by decree. We see that here in the United States. We see it in Hungary with Orbán, an extreme example of rule by decree. So all of these things, and I'm going to conclude now, I got one more thing to say. I got to, by way of conclusion, two other points. These things are happening so quickly. It's really hard to keep up with the analysis. I start analyzing some of this. I write an article, but I'm sure the same with many of you. A day or two later, things have developed so quickly, we can barely wrap our mind around how to analyze all of this. But I think now this is going to get to the heart of how we can understand the post-pandemic situation emerging in terms of the global political economy, that there has been already a restructuring of space. And now this is going to intensify as a function of that inequality and polarization, and also as a function of accumulation. And this is going to is already taking place in the global megacities, the urban poor and the global megacities. They're the sites of where the global police state beats down on the population, and they are the sites of the battle for the future. Before the pandemic, I had been speaking about the restructuring of space by using the metaphor of green zones and gray zones. Because when the US invaded, in 2003, invaded and occupied Iraq, they set up in the center of Baghdad the green zone, which was impenetrable. It was protected by the US military, by the new Iraqi military, and in there was the US occupation forces in the green zone, but also the new Iraqi elite and middle and professional and privileged strata. And they were protected from this mayhem and destruction that engulfed the whole rest of Baghdad and the whole country. So the idea is the green zone is where the global wealthy and the powerful are residing, and the gray zone is that mass of humanity, especially in the global megacities, which are subject to global police state. And there's spatial restructuring to separate them physically, and there's policing on one side, and there's internet and services on the other side. But here's the thing, and so that's one metaphor. I don't have time here to go into this fundamental spatial restructuring that has been taking place worldwide. But here's the thing that now goes with the pandemic to a whole new level. And I want to make this analytical point really clear because it's so important, that the pandemic and the types of technologies now occupying the very center of what's going on with the pandemic involves now spatial restructuring through virtual space. And the lockdowns are a dry run for controlling and restricting the circulation of labor and of surplus labor, channeled through virtual space. So this is a little technical for those of you who are not familiar with the political economy. Idea here, though, is that there's more tighter controlling of the distribution of labor power. Human beings, in other words, their actual circulation, their actual movement is going to be more and more tightly controlled, but not so much through lockdowns, through forced lockdowns. Those will be lifted. But the outcome of this is going to be a virtualized control of space in a way which there's much more tighter control of the circulation of labor, with dramatic political implications and implications for resistance. So you're both controlling the movement of labor, and you're turning labor into virtual labor more and more. So what have we seen with the lockdowns? All around the world, the lockdowns might have been necessary to respond to the health emergency, but at the same time, they are creating the conditions for this more tighter control of the global working class. And also these lockdowns around the world have been enforced through repression. All of you have seen, if you're watching the television screens, how in India, the mass repression of the 200 million migrants who are trying to walk home, 150, 200 kilometers. You've seen in South Africa, the police and army deployed to the streets and literally beating people who don't lock themselves into the house. But you also see this, for instance, in Central America, 30 to 40,000 people have been detained, put in jails because they violated a lockdown. Why? Because they have to go out to the streets or they starve to death. You've seen that here in the United States. So what's going on with the quarantines besides the repressive enforcement of those quarantines and the states of emergency that have been decreed? You have quarantines disaggregating labor further, meaning we're speaking here virtually, but social, political, workers' movements are going to be more and more disaggregated through this virtual space. And you are also going to have, through this restructuring accelerated by the pandemic, vastly expansion of cognitive proletarianization. That is the precaritization of a cognitive proletariat controlled through virtual space. And what that means is, to use a technical sociological term, a dispersal of subjectivities even more, meaning if we want to change the world and work together and organize, we need to come together physically about that, but also in terms of our subjective understanding and discussion and so forth. But the transformations, this restructuring, which is now accelerated, further disperses subjectivities, and it also further locks out surplus labor. Okay. So emerging from the health emergency, we are going to have mass employment. We already have unemployment. We already have it. But many of those that have been newly made unemployed will not be reabsorbed into the global workforce. And you're going to have that mass unemployment allowing for intensified super exploitation of those that do get their jobs back or still work. And just a preview, for instance, in the United States of what we've seen of that is that the meat packing workers, meat processing, meat packing, and the majority are immigrant workers, have been forced back to work under extremely onerous conditions. But more than that, there's been a speed up. Trump said, since this is an essential service, we can speed it up. In other words, how many cows you can slaughter or chickens you can slaughter, the amount was regulated. Now they have no regulation. They can slaughter as many of them. So there's work speed ups and all other kinds of ways of super exploiting workers. Agricultural workers, also immigrants. Agricultural workers already receive starvation wages here in the United States. Trump decreed that the agricultural output is essential, and therefore lowered their wages, their official wages, lowered it. So you see this intensified super exploitation is going to be all around the world because of mass unemployment. And secondly, mass unemployment will allow the transnational capitalist class and capitalist states to heighten discipline over the global working class and to disconnect surplus labor from social reproduction spending. We are going to see the attempts at a new round of social austerity, privatization, deregulation, in sum, an all-out assault on the global working class. So I would be remiss if by way of conclusion, I didn't say something politically about our struggles from below. So I will conclude with this. The struggle for a post-COVID-19 world has already begun. And we've seen in recent years a political polarization worldwide between insurgent popular forces, social movements, and the left on the one hand, especially after 2008, and an insurgent of far-right reactionary forces and neo-fascist forces. And the latter, the neo-fascist forces, have been gaining space more rapidly, I would say, than us on the left. And so let's remember that restructuring crises, which we're in, are times of rapid social change. And in times of rapid social change, human agency may play a more prominent role relative to structure. You know, we always say there's a structure which structure plays a role and agency plays a role, but agency can do more during times of crisis. And these are times that are incredibly unpredictable and things can go in many different directions. And also structural crises can move to systemic crises. Systemic crisis is a third type of crisis, meaning the only way out of that crisis is to overthrow the system itself. And so if a structural crisis such as we're in now moves towards a systemic crisis, and how it unfolds depends on a whole host of political and subjective factors, which cannot be predicted beforehand and which we are involved in generating, those political and subjective factors. So the struggle against the depredations of global capitalism that we've all been involved in is now conjoined with the struggles against the fallout from the pandemic and shaping the direction of the post-pandemic world. Let's remember that periods of intense social and class struggle, which is upon us now, coincide with periods of capitalist crisis, such as the 1930s, the 1960s and 70s, 2008, and now we're on the eve of a massive new round of class and social struggle worldwide. The pandemic has the potential to wake up millions of people from political apathy. It's crucial at this time, therefore, to wage and intensify ideological struggle, counter-hegemonic struggle, to take advantage of the fact that the pandemic reveals the incapacity of capitalist states to manage this crisis. Remember that in fall 2019, right on the eve of the pandemic, there were mass mobilizations all around the world, and they were linking up with one another. They were understood each other. From France, the yellow vests and everything else going on in France, from Lebanon to Chile to Haiti to Iraq to Hong Kong to the United States. 2017 to 2019 saw the biggest strike wave in the United States since the 1970s. And the pandemic momentarily pushed people off the streets, but that will change. It already is changing. And the ruling groups fear this growing discontent, this growing volcano from below, which is why they will intensify the global police state at this time. So our strategy, and I conclude with this, and this is my contribution to our political discussion about what to do, what is to be done, is that we have to establish now a favorable correlation of forces emerging from the health emergency. And that involves especially marginalizing the fascist response to the crisis and preventing a restoration of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is bankrupt, it can't resolve the crisis. It's moribund, but it's not dead. And so our platform of struggle, I suggest, should involve two key aspects. One is demanding and struggling for massive bailouts for the global working class, including formal and informal workers. And secondly, building a united front against fascism. And these two planks of our platform go together very closely because the would-be social base of a fascist project is those millions of people that have been displaced by the crisis and are suffering struggles of survival because of the crisis. And so we want that to be our social base. So these two planks of our struggle, massive bailouts for the global working class, united fronts against fascism, they really go together. They're complementary to each other. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Okay, I see that there's quite a discussion already going on the chat, which is really good, and hopefully there's a few questions that can sort of emerge quite quickly out of that. So just a brief word on how we're going to do this, because we've got 46 participants, which is brilliant, but if everyone talks at once, obviously it won't be very sensible. So if you want to speak, if you go onto participants, there's a function where you can raise your hand. There's a little blue hand symbol. And if you click on that, then I can call you by turn and you can ask a question or make a contribution, hopefully sort of keep it within 2 to 3 minutes. So if we've got any blue hands raised, I can call people out. And as I said, that's, you click on participants and raise your hand there. Okay, Neil. I've unmuted you.
Okay, there's something wrong with your speaker, I think, Rowan. I don't know whether you can do anything about it. It sounds as if you're underwater.
Okay.
I've just mentioned it. There may be nothing you can do about it. Look, this may be more appropriate, really, as for William to come back on a little bit later in the discussion. But it's this question: I mean, I agree with everything you're saying, and you're characterizing the modern global working class in a way that is quite radically different, really, from the working class of the 1970s, 1980s, where you had very high levels of workplace-based trade union organization, and the real strength of the class was in the workplace. That's where the power of workers was. And in the case of our history, if we think back to the 1980s, what was the 1980s all about? When they rolled out the neoliberal counter-revolution, it was smashing those key battalions of organized labor, one after the other, most crucially the miners, but a whole series of vanguard sections of the working class that was essentially based around trade union organization. Now, what you're describing, of course, is a very different kind of working class today, a much higher proportion of precarious workers, a much higher proportion of workers who are, in fact, as you put it, surplus, and even among those workers who are in relatively secure, better paid jobs, very often trade union organization, which is a fraction of what it was in the 70s or the 80s, if it exists at all. I mean, no, very, very little serious union strength. Now, so my question is this: given the changing structure of the working class, what are your thoughts about the forms which rank and file working class struggle are likely to take in the period ahead, and therefore the kind of organization that revolutionaries, socialists should be trying to build at a rank and file level to build and generalize resistance? Where do we, our side, where does the global working class get its striking power from in this period of unprecedented, really, precarity and huge numbers of surplus people? But it might be that we want to hear one or two more questions, and that comes a little bit later in the discussion, but let's see how it goes.
Thank you. I don't know if my speaker sounds a little better now. I've got a headphone.
It's much better.
Excellent. The next person who wants to speak or ask a question is Dan. And I'll unmute. I just lost Dan.
Hello, Rome. Yeah.
You can hear me. Okay, great.
Hi. Yeah, it's just a quick question, actually. Obviously, the talk was brilliant, by the way. Really enjoyed it. And in terms of what you said about the kind of international nature of the crisis, our response will need to be international as well. So in terms of what Neil was saying about what we can do to build things up, like, you know, totally agree with that question as well. But on what basis could we do it on an international level? Like, are there things like world conferences, things we could build up? Like in the early 2000s, there were things like the European Social Forum and the World Social Forum. Could something like that, but probably even on a more radical basis, be built up? And how would that be done? And what potential do you think there is to build something like that, which at the very least revolutionaries could intervene into?
Thank you. And Simon.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, hi everyone. It's Simon from South London here. Thank you for the talk, William. That was comprehensive and thorough and very, very interesting indeed. I just wanted to make kind of points related to the question of deglobalization. Now, when I use that phrase, I mean it in a sort of relative sense, because obviously we are still in a period in which globalization, i.e. kind of, you know, the growth of a multiplicity of international connections and kind of global trade and so on, is still happening, parce COVID-19. But that is the general tenor of the world in the last few years. But one of the things I think when we talk about the rise of the global far right, I think we have to factor in a process of the beginning of elements of deglobalization. And I think it's just elements of it. I don't think it's happening yet. But I think we can see from the collapse of the Doha trade round with the World Trade Organization, the fact that the G7, which used to be a very powerful organization, if anyone remembers, you know, the protests out against it in Genoa in 2001, has now massively expanded to become the G28, which has rendered it less capable of facilitating the process of globalization as more and more countries try and fight for their own sort of like position within it. And the growing trade wars between China and the USA, obviously something that Trump is really pushing. I think the other factor, which is, you know, beginning to shift the dynamic of the world, is the question of the disruption of American hegemony, which is really dominant from the 1990s onwards, the whole kind of Pax Americana thing of Clinton and the New Democrats, in the sense that now we're in a multipolar world, because China, which is the beneficiary of globalization in the sense that, you know, China's gone from a relatively poor nation to, you know, as powerful, nearly as powerful as the United States, not necessarily militarily yet, but certainly in terms of its economy, a very powerful country. And all these things are, you know, creating greater destabilization. And I think that what we're seeing in terms of the rise of the far right is, at least on a political level, they are trying to respond to globalization in a negative way, in a way which is politically at least kind of nationalist, reactionary, semi-fascistic politics. I think William's right to point out that behind the rhetoric of people like Trump, there is the reality that actually a lot of these people and organizations are still engaged in sort of globalization and so on. So on one level, there's, like it's just kind of a rhetorical thing, but nevertheless, I think it's a very important thing to kind of think about, because if we think back, like the last speaker, Dan, just mentioned the European Social Forum and the World Social Forum, the left used to dominate the argument around globalization with a progressive anti-capitalist, anti-systemic argument. And then since the decline of the anti-capitalist movement globally, what we're seeing now is that the far right are beginning to hegemonize the question of fighting globalization, standing up for national rights. We represent, the quote unquote white working class against kind of, mass migration and so on. And that's a very dangerous shift, which is why I, really believe that, the arguments that we need to have to be internationalist arguments. They have to be socialist arguments. I like William's points at the end about, massive bailouts for the working class and United Front against fascism. But I think we also need to be making very clear socialistic arguments, like in a kind of global crisis of capitalism, the worst since the 1930s, which is what we're entering now. We have to make socialist arguments. It can't just be defensive arguments, sort of saying, stop austerity or save healthcare. It has to be positive, proactive socialist arguments to counter the kind of collapse of capitalism.
Would you like to come back on some of those, William, before I take on, I think there's 5 people who have their hands raised, but that would be probably too many to respond to in one go.
So I'll respond to those 3, and then we'll go to another round. Yeah. So these are really critically important questions, and more than questions, they're things that we need to discuss. I mean, there's going to be many sessions to analyze and discuss all of this. But let me start with the middle one. I think Dan was his name that asked that. Absolutely. I've been arguing, but not just me, all over the world, we've been arguing that we have to transnationalize. I prefer to use transnational to distinguish it with an earlier concept of international solidarity. Everyone has their national struggles and we support each other's struggles. I think we need something more than that, transnational struggle. So I prefer to use that term, but absolutely. And the World Social Forum it still exists, but it's largely defunct. And recently this Progressive International was formed, and that's certainly a step forward. That's something good. We can critique some aspects of it. And also Samir Amin put out a call for a 5th international right before his death, I think 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And that sparked a whole lot of debate and a whole lot of forums. I participated in some of those forums. But what I'm trying to get at is that all around the world, the left is aware that we need to not just say rhetorically that we have to transnationalize our struggles. That's the only way we can confront global capitalism through transnational coordinated struggles, and a program of struggle around which we all agree, some minimal points of a program of global struggle. And so there's a critical awareness of that. I think one of the, and by the way, there's 2 dimensions to that. One is coordinating mass struggles and social movements. The other is some type of an umbrella political organization that goes beyond what the World Social Forum was. So that we're critically aware of that. And one of the dimensions, because everything is a 2-edged sword for capital. So capital is pushing us into this virtual world where we'll now, like all of us are speaking right now virtually, but that also opens up, and this is not new either. The first rounds of global digitalization and globalization meant that we could communicate through internet, but now there's much greater ease in coordinating and communicating and seeing the images of our different struggles and different circumstances all over the world more than ever. And the pandemic and post-pandemic restructuring will heighten that. So there's certain conditions that also favor us on the left worldwide and popular movements worldwide for thinking about how to deepen the transnationalization of struggles. But absolutely, to conclude what Dan is raising, we need more than discussing things transnationally. and we need to coordinate our struggles around a common program. And we do need an umbrella global organization, whether we want to call it a fifth international, whether we want to call it the progressive international, whatever we want to call it. Absolutely. I want to work backwards actually and go then to what Neil was raising. And Neil, you're absolutely right that the global working class, its composition, its relationship with capital, how it's, you know, it's dramatically a new global working class. We still have an industrial working class, but the vast majority of the global working class is, to begin with, in services, right? Not in industry. Tremendously precaritized. I'm repeating what you already pointed out. Tremendous chunk of the global working class is surplus labor. You're still part of the working class. You have nothing to sell but your labor power, but you're not able to sell it. And a tremendous portion, overlaps with precaritization, is informal labor. And you know, we're seeing with the lockdown now that literally hundreds of millions of informal workers that need to sell something on the street or what have you can't. And then you have a whole chunk of the global working class, which is officially characterized as self-employed, but we know that's a farce. You're not a consultant, you're not self-employed. If you're an Uber driver, you're working for a global multi-billion-dollar corporation, which is Uber. For instance. So we absolutely have to, and a lot of people are already doing this, we have to think about new types. We still need workers' organizations, absolutely, and unions, call them unions. But we need to think of new ways of conceiving unions and mass worker organizations. And a lot of this has already been discussed. One is social movement unionism, in the sense that there's unions wherever workers are organizing, but linked to other social movements and linked to community struggles, linking struggles around production to struggles around social reproduction. The other thing is that, and this just began in the United States, for the longest time, the trade unions in the United States didn't organize or accept immigrant workers, which is pathetic, saying that immigrant workers are pushing wages down and so forth. But after the mass uprisings of immigrant workers and the supporters that we had in 2006 here, the trade unions began to change that. But we need to think of unions in terms of organizing. The unemployed can join unions because the unemployed are workers who simply can't sell their labor power. We need to think, so the surplus labor and the unemployed, and how precarious workers and so-called self-employed workers are all part of what should be labor organizing and organizing unions. We had an Uber strike here. This again, you know, a whole lot of this happened on the eve of the pandemic. So the Uber strike was actually a little bit earlier. I think it was last May or June. But the Uber workers here in the United States and worldwide, every country, all around like 30 countries reported some limited participation of Uber workers went on strike. Then you had the 250 million workers that went on strike in India, the largest single strike in the history of humanity. So I mean, I think I really don't have an answer because it wasn't so much a question as much as a discussion point, but we need to deepen the analysis of what is the nature of the global working class, not the old industrial working class is just one component of it, and really creatively think about different types of workers' unions or workers' organizations that incorporate all these different types of workers in the global working class. And of course, this discussion is linked to Dan's question and the discussion, which is transnationalizing the struggle. We have a global working class and forms of organizing that working class, and its struggle also needs to be definitely transnational. And then finally, and I saved this for last, I'm not sure why, but also because it's such an enormous discussion, the issue of deglobalization. Well, first of all, I want to say that there is a push towards deglobalization, both among the left or sectors of the left, and also now these fascist shock troops and fascist organizations. But we need to be clear that on several things. The transnational capitalist class doesn't want deglobalization at all. On the contrary, the transnational capitalist class or transnational capital through this new round of restructuring is going to be more deeply globalized. And it's going to have pressures for more deeper global integration of the circuits of capital worldwide. And even if you have, because like The Economist, I have the most recent issue of The Economist right in front of me here, and the cover page says, is there deglobalization? Is there going to be deglobalization? But even if some industries return to original countries of origin, for instance, if the masks, the medical masks being produced in China by maybe 3M, I think 3M is a US company based in Wisconsin, even if it returns to the US, we need to be clear, first of all, number one, that as it returns to, if industry returns to higher wage zones, because industry went to lower wage zones because of the more ability to super exploit and intensify profit. So even if a handful of industries return to the high wage zones that they escaped from through globalization, they will do so through a level of technological and organic composition of capital that there'll be no workers whatsoever. So that's how you get around having to pay high wages in the core countries, right? There's no workers. So it won't change the contradictions of capital. Saying that, but here's the thing. It's not just that Trump is rhetoric when he talks about his populism and his nationalist agenda. We want to remember here, and there's a little bit of theory here, I won't go a lot into detail, but we need to be clear on the nature of the capitalist state, and we need to be clear on the relationship of the state to capital, right? They're intimately intertwined. It's a capitalist state which is subject to the pressure of capital and therefore serves the needs of capital accumulation. But the capitalist state faces a contradictory mandate in a nation state, but in this context in global capitalism. On the one hand, the capitalist states around the world have to promote and generate the conditions for global capital accumulation. You have to generate conditions in your country to attract transnational capital to invest. You have to open up, you have to deregulate, you have to liberalize trade. That's what the capitalist state has to do in order to ensure capital accumulation in your territory, which means assuring transnational capital accumulation. But the second thing the capitalist state has to do is assure legitimacy inside the nation state. That doesn't take place globally. So the capitalist state has to, and somehow at least pretends to or claim to be representing some general interest in the interest of all citizens, all workers in the nation state. And these are contradictory functions. So they create these contradictions between seeking legitimacy and promoting transnational capital accumulation. They're contradictory functions, and they generate this spiraling crisis of legitimacy that I mentioned. And it's this spiraling crisis of legitimacy and the devastation wrought on workers everywhere that is feeding into the discourse and the mobilizing efforts of the fascist right. But that we don't want to lose sight of transnational capital. And I know this is a big debate. I've been involved in this debate for 20 years. So when Trump imposed tariffs on steel, Marxists, my Marxist critics, forget about other critics, my Marxist critics says, look, William, that's not transnational capital. See, Trump is protecting national capital in the United States. We're reversion to deglobalization, reversion to rival national capitals. But look, the biggest steel producer inside US territory is Mittal. Mittal Steel is the biggest global conglomerate based in India, Indian-based global steel producer. And the CEO of Mittal, I forgot his name, announced that he loved Trump's tariffs because Mittal bought up the majority share in US steel. And Trump, when he announced those tariffs, said, US steel is a symbol of the United States. We got the best steel in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But US steel is majority owned by this Indian conglomerate, right? And they loved the tariffs. On the other hand, smaller scale producers, because that's the other argument. William, you're wrong because there's local and national capital, that is in competition with transnational capital. The smaller steel producers in the United States that imports cheaper steel from China, right? It would be more expensive if they used US made steel. Cheaper steel from China suddenly had tariffs on that steel, and they were against the tariffs. So you have Mittal based in India loving the tariffs. You have US based local national steel companies rather than global hating the tariffs. You have the Koch brothers. That's what my other critics also told me. Look, the Koch brothers are classically like national capital, not transnational. Koch brothers spent $30 million to oppose Trump's tariffs. So why did Trump declare these tariffs? Well, not Trump the individual, that's not important. If we put that aside, we can analyze him. But this is the responding to this crisis of legitimacy of the US state, but not in a way which undermined capitalist or transnational capital at all. Honda produces and sells more cars in the United States than outside the United States. And GM produces most of its cars and markets most of its cars in China. So when we talk about US-Chinese geopolitical competition and trade wars, it's real, but it's not, we can't understand it the way we used to understand these things, right? Rival capitals using their rival nation states. It's a different thing going on. So, to conclude there then, because the issue of fascism is the key thing, there's absolutely a global backlash against capitalist globalization because it's devastating mass of humanity. And absolutely, the fascists are trying to organize that devastated mass base. And we have to confront all of that, and the right-wing nationalism and, of those fascist forces. But we also need to be clear analytically and theoretically how this relates to capital and to the capitalist states. So again, it's a much bigger discussion than we can manage here.
Thank you. I am going to take the people who currently have their hands up, and if they could keep their portions to within about 2 minutes, if possible, because we've got a bit of a tight time now. First, I'm going to take John S. And I've unmuted you, John.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I wanted to quickly talk about or ask about universal income, sort of universal basic income, which has been a sort of proposal that's been coming up in particular in the context of the pandemic, where people have been losing their jobs by the million, and there are many, many millions more who are potentially at risk as well. So it's been raised on the left as a significantly important way of keeping people alive, basically, and keeping them fed and in housing. And that's obviously really critical and important. But you've been talking about crisis, and specifically about a crisis of underconsumption related to overaccumulation, and the idea that capitalism runs out of markets, it runs out of people to buy things. And my understanding is that prior to this particular crisis, people like Hillary Clinton were quite interested in the idea of universal basic income, and other sort of senior sort of thinkers and leaders of the capitalist class were also debating it. And it can be seen, I suspect, as a partial solution to that crisis of underconsumption. So the question is, to what extent can that tactic, the call for some form of universal basic income, backfire? How much of it is a progressive and left policy, and how much is it actually possible for it to be taken on board precisely to overcome the current structural crises that we're facing? Just as a very final point, you were talking about the virtualization of work. There is actually a gaming programmers union in the States that was set up entirely virtually. It's got chapters all over the world, in fact, and it was quite effective. It's been around for 2 or 3 years. It was set up virtually online. People who didn't meet each other physically did organize and managed to sort of improve terms and conditions, fought in particular against the sort of sexist treatment of women who were being underpaid and treated badly in many other ways. And so maybe one of the things we have to think about is, where possible, the virtualization of the labor movement to some extent as well.
Thank you. And I'm going to take Paul Crofts next, and I've unmuted you, so when you're ready to speak. Oh no, sorry, I think you're still muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Two short points. Firstly, there hasn't been any reference at all to the threat in this medium to longer term of global warming and the effects that that's going to have on both the economic and political, social way we do things. So that's the first question. Where does this come in to the current debates? Because that's going to come on board once the pandemic's over. We've got the challenges that we'll be facing us then, but then on top of that, we've got the global warming and the threats to global environment, which is being proposed. And the second question is, does the Green New Deal, which is often put forward by many people on the progressive left, particularly in Europe, but also increasingly in the global south, as a possible campaigning focus at an international level, does this provide a framework of the Green New Deal for that kind of internationalization of our movement?
Thank you. And I'm going to take Derek next, and I've unmuted you, so you should be able to speak now. Thank you.
Okay, well, my question to William was about the relationship between international capital or transnational capital, as he calls it, and the national state, which he has recently in his last bit actually referred to, and he mentioned the fact that the American corporations may be working, building in China, and Indian corporations are working in the United States. But I think there's, well, maybe other people can come in on this, but there is certainly a strong relationship between, say, Facebook and the United States. Or if looking at, from a UK point of view, you think about the post-Brexit negotiations between the UK and the US and the future trade deal, where the stumbling block, at least publicly, the public stumbling block was on clash between, US agricultural interests and pharmaceutical interests against what was, basically a pushback from in this country, from agriculture, British agriculture, and in terms of agricultural standards, and the public and left organisations about, the pharmaceutical industries getting a stranglehold on the British National Health Service. So I wonder if, other comrades could perhaps, or William could go back to this, because I'm a bit confused about this relationship, because on the one hand, I get this idea that it's not simple, oh, here we've got a UK company, here we've got a French company. It's more complex than that, but these companies still exist. I mean, Daimler-Benz is a German company, isn't it, which is going to look to the German government to pursue its own interests. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. We have DJ next, and I've unmuted you, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Ron.
And you should be able to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Joy. Yeah, I thought William made lots of interesting points on the nature of the new fascism. I'm still not convinced, though, on this concept of the transnational capitalist class, because I agree certainly that you saw a massive internationalization of capital from the collapse of Bretton Woods onwards. But what we're seeing now is that's being rolled back. I mean, I work in finance, yeah, and I tell you, you talk to people at top guys in JP Morgan, MSCI, whatever, they thought Trump was batshit. If you look at the leaders of big industries in the UK, take FTSE 100. FTSE 100 companies were unanimously opposed to the British incarnation of it, Brexit. Where you saw support for this, if you like, this resurgent right, it's lower down the cap scale. It's the FTSE 250 and it's small caps. It's those companies that had much more nationally focused markets. And whereas I don't disagree that you will find elements of international capital that have got bases in other markets that are able to take advantage of that, those are exceptions. They're not the rules. If you look at the people who supported Trump to start with, there was quite a good article in Jacobin on this a few months ago. They tended to be those US sectors that were like coal, basically regressive, nationally focused industries that, far from being internationally competitive, were the ones that were being squeezed out, and Trump threw them a lifeline. William made reference before to the importance of tech companies, and I think it's absolutely right. But then look at the massive division globally in tech companies. You've got the FANGs, or what's known as the FANGs in the States. You've got Facebook, Google, yada yada. Counterposed to that, you've got what's poetically bats and fangs. Great. So you got Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and the disputes around intellectual property, and I don't think you just dismiss tariffs. The tariff issue is massive, and it's costly because it makes the movement of capital. It's a cost on trade. I think what you're seeing here, rather than this being international capital, transnational capital working through an agenda, it's a classical case of national capitals playing beggar thy neighbor. That's what tariffs always have been. And that's what political economists and economists since David Ricardo onwards have recognized their function. Sorry, done that. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last person I think we have is Phil Hurst, and I've unmuted you, and you. Oh, no. Sorry, the unmute doesn't seem to be working.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there you go. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Well, look, I think this has been an excellent meeting. Absolutely brilliant introduction. I didn't mind that it went on twice as long as it was supposed to, because the problem that we have, I think the left has, is we're in a world where things are changing so quickly and so dramatically. We're having a problem to synthesize all this. And the things that comrades have raised, for example, the last two contributions about the environment and about international capitalist competition, these aren't crazy ideas. These are things that we have to debate out. So I think we need at least one return match with William to discuss all these things through. We've been trying in Mutiny to try and work out how does the economic crisis link to the environmental crisis and with the pandemic. Those are the three things we have to see the relationship of, and what are the political consequences of that. And I thought the things that William said about the base of modern fascism, that's the danger that we have. That we're in a competition with the right. One thing I think that is really important in the analysis that William has brought forward is the notion of militarized accumulation. And if you look at all the points when world capitalism since World War II has made a big thrust forward and stabilized itself and grown, they've all been connected with different phases of militarization. The Korean War, Reagan and Star Wars, the Gulf War, and the globalized, the idea of a peace state is tightly integrated with the idea of globalized, militarized accumulation, the pouring of vast amounts of military equipment on the American police forces, for example, such to the Gulf War, absolutely militarized policing and war on terror, the war on drugs, all that kind of stuff. We've got to go into that. We've got to popularize it in the left, this discussion, and get it much further out than the limited number of people here. I'm going to raise just one thing that I think is a nuance. Are we beyond imperialism? Is the concept of imperialism any use to us today? I tend to say yes, it is. I noticed that we have here, he hasn't spoken, this is still here, Gregory Wilcock, who, yes, he is still here. Greg has been one of those people who's run the main website about the Venezuelan revolution. And I think it'd be difficult to be in Venezuela today and be on the left and not understand the relationship of the United States to Venezuela as an imperialist one. And we've got to get into more the military confrontation between the United States and China, which is incredibly dangerous. Just one last point. I agreed completely with what Simon said, and that is this. And United Front Against Fascism, big relief package for the international working class and so on. But you can't defeat the fascists just by being anti-fascist. We have to put forward positive alternatives. Yeah? And I think we have to use the word revolutionary in this period. If there was ever a period when only revolutionary solutions would do, it's now.
Thank you. And I think that's everyone. I've just had a message from someone on the board whose internet connection is having some difficulties. Sarah, and she said, she made a contribution that I'll quickly read out. It is often said that the labor of social reproduction is made invisible under capitalism. Some of that has been violently exposed in the last 3 months by the problems, for example, in the US and UK, of the governments in managing the world of hospitals and care homes, on inadequate workforces, on poverty pay during the epidemic, or in the treatment of the meat packers. Just yesterday, the British government was forced by mass outcry to abolish certain discriminatory charges on residential limitations on migrant workers, including cleaners in the health service, thus undermining their own everyday racism attitude to these migrant workers. I think there are very useful materials out there, materials and works on social reproduction theory, such as Silvia Federici on the collection edited by Tifi Bhattacharya, which can help everybody to make more sense of capital's attitude to the various sectors of the working class, of the surplus population and reserve army of labor, and of the ways of various sectors, including those fighting on the climate crisis front. And I think that's everybody's contributions. So if William would like to come back on that to sort of summarize, there's a lot there, and we probably don't have enough time to cover it all, but just some sort of essential points. And then Simon, if he's available still, can come in and sort of talk about mutiny a little bit. Thank you.
So, as you just said, Rowan, these are fantastic questions, but again, they're not questions, they're discussion points that, to do justice to, we'd have to have a lot more time. Let me start with John, but this goes together with Paul. The issue of global warming and actually UBI is these two things, and Green New Deal are deeply connected. So the universal basic income, my own view politically is that it is something we should be fighting for. Anything which helps to ameliorate and improve the conditions of devastated, working classes, and is a demand that we have to put forward. So that would be moving forward, having UBI. So that's from below, right? But absolutely, a first step demands in a struggle for socialism. I mean, previously someone mentioned socialism. I mean, that is, I didn't think I even needed to say that, right? The largest struggle here absolutely has to be anti-capitalist for socialism. But the struggle for UBI, I think, is an absolute social welfare demand, which should be part of our struggles. But then we need to see UBI from above. Those from above, why are they, why is there support from above for UBI? And one of the things that's gone on, and of course, this is a tremendous simplification, how I'm going to respond to these major points right now, is that the transnational elite, and when I say transnational elite, I'm not so much referring to transnational capitalist class, of course, the politically active elements of the transnational capitalist class, George Soros, for instance, but also the organic intellectuals and technocrats that do the thinking and work out the strategies of the transnational capitalist class, and they do so in forums such as the World Economic Forum and Council for Foreign Relations and so forth. So the transnational elite has among it a reformist element, an element which has recognized that you need to save capitalism from itself by undertaking significant reforms. And there have been a lot of defections from the neoliberal camp in this regard. George, what's his name, Stiglitz Stiglitz, for instance, but many others. And they have been, these reformist elements among the transnational elite have been pushing for significant redistributive policies, including taxation policies, including controls on speculative finance crossing borders and so forth. And they are also supporting some of these reformist fractions, the universal basic income. And that is, of course, a neo-Keynesian strategy, right? The problem is not from us from below, that we need to demand universal basic income as part of a larger struggle for socialism, for more fundamental transformation and conflict with global capital. But UBI cannot resolve the underlying structural crisis of global capitalism. It will not resolve the problem of declining rates of profit and overaccumulated capital. It will stimulate a little more demand, but it cannot do the trick. That's because of time. That's all I can say about that. But John also mentioned virtual organizing and a virtual labor movement, and absolutely, that's the point that I made previously. That the tremendously accelerated digitalized restructuring of global capitalism, involving the virtualization of labor, disaggregation of the working class, does also open up the opportunities for virtual organizing and virtual connections for us from below. The issue of global warming, I didn't mention it because we have such small time, but you can't talk about the global crisis without talking about the climate emergency and without talking about the ecological dimension of the crisis. I mean, that goes without saying. And our larger demand, I used to call myself a socialist, now I call myself an eco-socialist. So the Green New Deal, and that's why I was linking this to UBI, the Green New Deal, which puts forward the struggle to improve the condition for the basic demands of the working class, for higher salaries, for stable employment and so forth, links those struggles together with the struggles for ecological struggles, is obviously our struggle. I mean, the global left has to take up that as part of its struggle, but again, with the understanding that we push that towards socialist struggles, towards anti-capitalist and socialist struggles. So we struggle for these reforms that are involved in the Green New Deal and that are involved in UBI, but as part of a larger struggle to push that into socialist struggles. So yes, the struggle for a Green New Deal and for UBI is our struggle, but we socialists, communists, push for much more. Derek, I want to link, let me just try and link a response to Derek, and also is talking about transnational capital and the nation state and Facebook. But again, I want to emphasize a few things here, that dialectical thinking involves understanding that, because the problem is a lot of the left forgets about thinking dialectically. So what is the key to dialectical and revolutionary thinking are several things. First, you distinguish surface appearance from underlying essence of a phenomenon. You see the surface appearance of phenomenon. Trump is talking like a populist, like a nationalist. Okay, Facebook is saying it wants the US to protect itself from Chinese competition. That's surface appearance. Now, you don't dismiss that, but you also want to see that our task here is to get to the underlying essence of the phenomenon. Secondly, part of dialectical thinking is to see that reality is driven by contradictions. So when you see one thing going on here, another thing which is contradictory to it going on here, it doesn't mean the phenomenon doesn't exist. It means that those are the contradictions, right? So we shouldn't be surprised when we see these contradictions. So I want to talk a bit, and this is also linked to the fourth speaker. I didn't get his name. The fourth speaker. So I was in the Philippines in 2008. Focus on the Global South had invited me. I gave some lectures at university, but then I went around the country meeting with the different left organizations. And I was at one of these meetings with leaders of the Philippine left. And I gave this argument on the transnational capitalist class. And I want to get to the issue of imperialism, because it's at the same time that I wrote an essay called Beyond the Theory of Imperialism, which has been largely misunderstood. So I want to speak to that. But at this meeting, someone got very upset with me, a revolutionary, who said, you know, we're still fighting for national liberation, and how can you say beyond the theory of imperialism? And I said, so what do you mean by imperialism? And it means when and she said, correctly so, quoting Lenin, you know, when capital from when capital and the countries of the core of the imperialist countries suck up the surplus of us imperialized countries subject to imperialism and take that surplus back to the core. And that transfer of wealth is, you know, classically what's understood as imperialism. So I said to her, well, okay, I have no problem with that classically, but look, and it happened to be by pure coincidence. I always read The Economist, because The Economist gives you the thinking of transnational capital. And I held up the particular issue whose cover story was Tata Motors. Now, you know, I know Tata Motors, the Tata conglomerate in India, is one of the biggest global corporations in the world, multi-trillion-dollar corporation. And Tata Corporation had that very week bought up Rolls-Royce in the United Kingdom, bought up Tesco, that's your guys' supermarket chain, bought up British Steel, and bought up Tetley Tea. Now, the irony here is that the India colonized, UK colonized India and set up all of these tea plantations, and that was Tetley Tea, the big tea conglomerate. But now all of these conglomerates were owned by Tata conglomerates, right? So I said to her, well, look, if that's the case, it's Tata, which is exploiting workers in the United Kingdom. And it's Tata, which is taking profits from Rolls-Royce, from Tetley Tea, from Tesco, from British Steel, and transferring it back to its coffers based in India. So now India is the imperialist power, imperializing UK. Now, obviously, that's not true. But what that shows us is that we have to have new ways of thinking. Let me jump to the issue of imperialism. When I critique imperialism, I'm not referring to that the US intervenes and tries to overthrow the Venezuelan revolution. If that's what we mean by imperialism, we still have imperialism. If what we mean by imperialism is that workers are exploited in one particular region, their surplus is generated, it's extracted by capital and moved to other regions or redistributed elsewhere. If that's what we mean by imperialism, then we still have imperialism worldwide. We have intervention with imperialism. But there's a couple things. First of all, I don't think that can be understood any longer as national capitals competing with one another. If that's what we mean by imperialism, we've moved beyond that. Lenin was right for what he analyzed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but now we have a different situation. The US intervened in Iraq, and everyone was saying at that time, most of the left was saying this is because they're in rivalry with French oil companies, with Chinese oil companies. This is a new round of imperialism. The US intervened and set up a military canopy and opened up Iraqi oil to transnational capital. And the very first two transnational oil companies that moved in, taking advantage of the US military canopy, protecting them, and privatized Iraqi oil, was the big Chinese state oil company. The very first one came in. And the second one was Total from France. And Total had opposed the US invasion, and so did China. So the situation is much more complicated. We have to really, the key here is to understand how capital has built-in expansion. The nature of capitalism is to expand outward, and as it does so, to bring in new sources of exploitation, new appropriations of surplus which is generated, and how that then is expressed politically. So that's a larger discussion. But I think we need to rethink imperialism. Now, what is happening right now, and I'll conclude with this. Again, there's so much here on the table, it's just I can't really deal with it in just a few minutes. But yes, there is, by the way, the theory of global capitalism that I put forward, which involves a theory of the transnational capitalist class, transnational state, etc., does not say that there's not competition. That's the nature. There won't be, if there's no competition, there's no capitalism. There's fierce competition. But it's not a US company competing with a French company, competing with a German company, because we have to study, as good Marxists and socialists, we have to start by studying empirically the world and then reach our conclusions. And we have to empirically study the structure of global capital. And when we do that, yes, the Mercedes-Benz turns to the German state. because it has its headquarters there and it has to respond to the regulations that establish the German state. But the investors in Mercedes-Benz are investor groups that are cross-invested with all over the world. So any capitalist group anywhere in the world which is invested in Mercedes-Benz has the same interest in propping up Mercedes-Benz. So Facebook, and I just studied this the last couple of weeks, Facebook and Microsoft and some of those other giant US-based companies, which again, the investors there come from all over the world. The bulk of investors might be Silicon Valley US citizens, absolutely. And they're competing with other giant groups. But what I've seen in the last few weeks is that they use the pretext that they need to compete with China in order to get the US state to do more, to deregulate them, allow them to do what they want, subsidize them, etc. And so you see how utilizing the nationalist and populist discourse of Trump, or even of the fascist right, can be utilized ideologically and politically to get the US state to give them concessions and increase their ability to accumulate capital and enhance their control. But it doesn't mean that they are involved in geopolitical, Facebook, for instance, geopolitical competition with China. Things are more complicated. That's why we have to look below this underlying essence of this phenomenon and not the surface appearance. Having said that, there is geopolitical competition. There's the danger of war. It's reaching the breaking point. I'm not denying that. I'm saying we have to understand it in ways differently than we did in the 20th or the 19th century. Finally, I'd be remiss, I know this is really quick, but if I didn't say something about social reproduction, I didn't catch the name of the person that raised that. And I love Silvia Federici's work. I think it's unbelievably fantastic. And there's the gender dimension here to the issue of social reproduction, but there's also the pandemic dimension to the issue of social reproduction. And there's the global working class dimension to social reproduction. So one of the things that neoliberal capitalist globalization has involved, breaking away from mid-20th century world capitalism that involved Keynesianism, it involves social welfare systems, is to take social reproduction out of the picture and just simply throw that onto workers and their families. And when you do that, you're throwing it onto women, right? Social reproduction. We know that social reproduction is part of production. They're falsely separated. Federici, among others, have already showed us that, and how social reproduction is part of the generation of surplus value, which is appropriated by capital. So our struggles have to be built around social reproduction as much as they're built around production. And what we're seeing with the pandemic is that the struggle for social reproduction is incredibly intensified, not just because of mass unemployment, but because of the lockdown and so forth. And so when you intensify the struggles around social reproduction, you're intensifying the burden on women and also on migrant workers. And so, you know, we were talking about previously what type of new working class and unions. I think it was originally Neil, that was the very first question or discussion point. So part of that has to be that worker organizations and unions place front and center the struggles around social reproduction, which means also front and center the gender dimensions of global class relations and the struggle against global capitalism. Now, if we had more time, I'd have a lot more to say about that and the other questions. So I apologize that being so brief, it means I'm simplifying and not able to really respond adequately to these issues.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, the scope of this debate, of this discussion could go into several more meetings easily. And I'd also like to thank everybody who's turned up and listened and who's watching on Facebook and on YouTube right now. And to finish off with Simon, who's going to come in and say a little bit about who we are as Mutiny and what we're currently doing as a group. So I've unmuted Simon. I should be able to speak now. Would you like to come in instead, Neil? I'm not able to unmute.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Hi everyone, I'll just take a minute of your time. So thanks for coming tonight. Mutiny is a new organisation. We're a group of people who met each other kind of in the Labour Party and kind of radical movements in Britain. And we want to make a kind of positive contribution to kind of theoretical and political discussions on the left, as well as organising actions and activities and working with other groups and tendencies and individuals on the left to try and, you know, create a kind of more positive culture on the left, as well as, you know, a left that can actually kind of get its act together and stand up to the kind of cataclysmic struggles that are facing us. So, you know, I think there's a lot of people out there who are kind of despairing at the moment over things like climate change and, you know, like all the things that are going on in the world. And sort of we want to say that, you know, it's important to stay active, to stay organised, and to keep campaigning. So yeah, so I've been posting up in the chat box a link to the Mutiny website. It's timetomutiny.org. We'll send everyone who joined tonight a thank you email as well as a link to the YouTube video of William's excellent talk, so you can watch it again if, you know, once wasn't enough. And if you wanted to share it around, of course, you're more than welcome to. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, and all the details are on the website, we'd love to hear from you. And we're going to be having future events coming up. We've got our next meeting next Thursday, which is going to be a question on what is class, obviously related to kind of the working class and why that matters. So if people would like to be involved in that discussion, then as I said, go on the website, timetomutiny.org, click contact us, leave us your details, and we'll be in touch and invite you to the next meeting.
Thank you, everyone. So did you want to say something, Neil, just then, or?
Well, only to thank William very, very warmly for this meeting. It's been a fantastic meeting. There's been lots of very, very positive comment on the chat, William. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and we hope to be able to invite you again very soon.
Thank you to you. Thank you to Mutiny.
Thanks, William.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Have a good
Bye
evening.
all.